So today I wanted to talk about the difference between frozen embryo transfer and fresh embryo transfer. There's not too much of a difference, but there definitely is some difference. We did a frozen embryo transfer, and I'll explain what that is in a minute, but my intended mother actually used an egg donor. So this surrogate baby is not genetically related to her. It is genetically related to her husband. They used her husband's sperm, and so they picked out an egg donor from an egg bank. I'm not too sure on the details about that, and I really can't give you too many details because it's confidential, but they essentially got eggs from this egg donor and sperm from the husband, and in a facility / lab they got at least 10 to 11 frozen embryos that were ready to hatch and be transferred into me. She did have a couple of transfers herself. I'm not sure the exact number. She did do IVF before this baby to have her daughter, but has chosen to use surrogacy now, and they did have the egg donor donate again, so these siblings will have a genetic relation. Anyways, so that's a little tidbit on that. If I'm looking down, it's because I have notes again. And I did want to talk a little bit about egg quality, or embryo quality. It is kind of a complicated thing, and every clinic will sort of have different qualities. It's not like there's a general kind of rule for all of them, but my intended mother had said that most of our eggs were double A's, if not A quality or AB quality. It's between A to C quality. C quality is not really that great, but you can still actually have a pregnancy with a BC, or I think there's even CC quality eggs. It really depends. You can completely not have a pregnancy with a double A embryo. It's super unpredictable, so egg quality isn't 100% guarantee that you're gonna have a pregnancy. Obviously you do want to use a higher quality embryo, but if you have a BC or a BB egg quality, you could still totally get pregnant, but you could still also not get pregnant. So that's kind of the sadness around IVF and the unpredictability around IVF. And I think of it too as if you're trying to conceive naturally, you have no idea what your egg quality is. So you could literally have a C quality all the time, but have 3 kids of your own. You would just never know. It's just now that we have all this technology, we can actually grade our embryos. So it is interesting, but it also can be kind of a heart-wrenching thing for people going through IVF. I want to note that the success rates for frozen embryo transfer and fresh embryo transfer are slightly different, but also not. And I know that probably isn't going to make any sense, but it's mainly because success rate is not predictable. So there's not 100%, yeah, if you do a fresh one, you're gonna 100% get pregnant. Yeah, if you do a frozen one, you're gonna 100% get pregnant as well. There's none of that. So with the frozen embryo transfer, the success rate is about 60% and above if you're 35 and younger. Now, that's not for everybody. That's just a general number. And the fresh embryo transfer is at 50% to 60% success rate. So it's pretty much the same. There really isn't a better one, so to speak. It kind of depends on either the mother or the surrogate's body. They've done a lot of frozen embryo transfers, but none of them have taken. They've all had miscarriages. They'll switch to a fresh embryo transfer and try that, and vice versa. It's just kind of, what works best for that person's body, but it's still really hard to predict that. Anyway, so let's just get into what the difference is. So a frozen embryo transfer, which is what we experienced, is you still go through all the regular IVF medications, which I talked about in my previous video. I'll link that above and below. So what essentially happens is that the lab technician dude, I'm not really sure what exactly his title is, but we're just going to say lab technician. They have the egg and the sperm, and they fertilize these two in a lab, and it can be a really unpredictable number about how many they have. Obviously, like, they'll have a way more sperm than eggs, but it doesn't really have, you know, like, oh, he only does 5 or something. Like, it's kind of depends on how many eggs were taken from the mother or the egg donor, and that's kind of like a whole nother video. But so they fertilize those eggs in the lab, and then they freeze them for however long the parents want or need, and that's where the term frozen is, because they're essentially put together, and then right when they're like in their moment of just about to hatch, they freeze it like super fast. And it's pretty cool. Like, when we went to the transfer, we got to like look in to the room that they actually have, and it's like it's a basic room, but it's pretty technical looking as well. They also test, so they test each one of these fertilized eggs to make sure that there's no abnormalities, and they also test the egg right before it's fertilized with the sperm as well. And they do that for both. Fresh embryo transfer is the egg is fertilized with the sperm in the lab and put into special incubators, and they wait until it's just about to hatch, and that's right when they transfer it either into the mother or the surrogate. So there's essentially no waiting period of freezing. A lot of times this is only done with one egg, so they don't have like multiple eggs kind of waiting. They just either have one really nice egg and I assume a couple of sperm, or sperm that are like perfect quality, and they fertilize those two, and then right as it's about to hatch, that's when they do the transfer. And I think that that's kind of why the success rates are about the same, because you're still putting the embryo into the uterus at the exact same time each time. So the frozen one, you're putting it in there, they obviously thaw it, and you're putting it into the uterus right as it's about to hatch, and the same with the fresh one. So it really kind of depends. I'm not really sure if I assume that the frozen embryo transfer would be a little bit more expensive, because you're actually freezing the eggs for a period of time, where the fresh one, you usually only have one embryo waiting in the lab, and you go right down when they tell you that the embryo is ready. Oh, and I did want to note that with the fresh embryo transfer, they're still taking the same IVF medications as with a frozen embryo transfer. So I think that that's all I really wanted to say. I feel like it's a little bit more common to do a frozen embryo transfer, but I've still seen and talked to a lot of surrogates who've done fresh ones and they've been successful, and the same with frozen. I mean, our frozen embryo transfer for this surrogacy has been successful. And yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and thanks so much for watching.